The Cold War is often remembered as a struggle between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. A conflict of ideologies, capitalism versus communism, East versus West. But there is a part of this story that is rarely told: Africa. As European empires collapsed, Africa emerged into independence. At the exact moment the world was dividing into rival camps, and in that moment, Africa became one of the most important and most overlooked battlegrounds of the Cold War. This is not a story of good and evil. It is a story of power, strategy, fear, hope, and unintended consequences. This is the story of how the Cold War shaped Africa. This channel is dedicated to uncovering untold stories from history, wars, and global conflicts. If that matters to you, take a moment to subscribe and let's explore these stories together. At the end of World War II, Europe was weakened. Colonial empires could no longer hold their overseas territories. Across Africa, nationalist movements gained momentum. Between the late 1950s and the 1970s, more than 30 African nations gained independence. But independence did not mean stability. New states inherited borders drawn by colonial powers, often grouping rival ethnic, religious, and political communities together. At the same time, the world was splitting into two camps. The United States promoted capitalism, private enterprise, and political pluralism. The Soviet Union promoted socialism, state control, and one-party rule. Both feared losing influence, and both saw Africa not just as a continent, but as a strategic prize. Africa mattered for four main reasons. First, geography. Africa sat between Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and the Atlantic. Control of sea routes, airspace, and military bases was crucial. Second, resources. Africa possessed oil, uranium, copper, diamonds, cobalt, and rare minerals. Some of the uranium used in the first atomic bombs came from the Congo. Third, ideology. New African nations were politically undecided. If they adopted socialism, the Soviet sphere expanded. If they adopted capitalism, Western influence grew. Fourth, symbolism. Winning African allies meant winning the support of the emerging, global South. Africa was not just territory, it was legitimacy. The Congo became one of the first major Cold War crises in Africa. In 1960, the Congo gained independence from Belgium. Patrice Lumumba became the country's first prime minister. He demanded true sovereignty and control over Congo's resources. But independence descended quickly into chaos. Belgian forces intervened. The mineral-rich Katanga region attempted to secede. The army mutinied. Lumumba asked the United Nations for help. When the UN refused to support him militarily, he turned to the Soviet Union. This alarmed the United States. Western governments feared Congo would become a socialist ally in Central Africa. Within months, Lumumba was removed from power, arrested, and later assassinated in 1961. Joseph Mobutu, with Western backing, eventually took control. He ruled for over 3 decades. The Congo crisis demonstrated how Cold War fears could override African sovereignty. Southern Africa became the most militarized region of Cold War Africa. In Angola, 3 liberation movements competed for power after independence from Portugal in 1975. The MPLA received support from the Soviet Union and Cuba. UNITA received support from the United States and apartheid South Africa. thousands of Cuban troops were deployed to Angola. Angola became one of the largest proxy wars of the Cold War. In Mozambique, a socialist government faced a Western-backed insurgency. These wars lasted decades. Millions died. Infrastructure collapsed. Entire generations grew up in conflict. In the Horn of Africa, Cold War alliances shifted dramatically. Ethiopia was once a key ally of the United States. In 1974, a Marxist military junta known as the Derg overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie. Ethiopia aligned with the Soviet Union. Somalia, once Soviet-aligned, switched sides and moved toward the United States. The Ogaden War of 1977 saw former allies fight each other with different superpower backing. This showed that Africa was not passive. African states made strategic choices, sometimes changing sides, to protect national interests. Across Africa, liberation movements emerged. Many received training, funding, and weapons from Cold War powers. The Soviet bloc often supported anti-colonial movements. Western powers often supported existing governments to prevent communist influence. In South Africa, the African National Congress received support from socialist countries. Meanwhile, Western governments maintained economic ties with the apartheid regime. Cold War ideology often overshadowed human rights concerns. African leaders were not merely pawns. Many used Cold War rivalry to their advantage. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana promoted Pan-Africanism while maintaining independence from Moscow. Julius Nyerere of Tanzania developed African socialism distinct from Soviet models. Mobutu used anti-communism to secure Western support, despite authoritarian rule. Cold War aid often strengthened strongmen and military regimes, but it also funded education, infrastructure, and state institutions. The results were mixed. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cold War funding ended. Many African states lost military and economic support overnight. Some conflicts continued, others faded. Economic crises followed, but political reforms also emerged. Multi-party systems expanded, civil society grew. A new era began. The Cold War had ended, but its legacy remained. Borders, institutions, conflicts, and alliances shaped during that era continue to influence Africa today. The Cold War did not simply happen to Africa. Africa was central to it. African leaders made choices. African societies adapted. African people paid the price. To understand modern Africa, we must understand this chapter, because history is not just about the past. It is about how the present came to be. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. By supporting this channel, you're helping us bring more honest, in-depth stories about history, wars, and global conflicts. Stay with us, there's much more to uncover.